who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers only you provide, 'cause you know just what we need before we say a word. You're a good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Peace so unexplainable, I can hardly think as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still into love. You're a good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways.
God, a perfect and holy God. We will come before you with hearts made clean by Jesus' blood. We are standing on holy ground, and I know that there are angels all around. Let us praise Jesus now. We are standing in His presence. We are standing in His presence. We are standing in His presence on holy ground. I worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you. I worship you, O Prince of Peace. That is what I want to do. I give you praise, for you are my righteousness. I worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you. I worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you. I worship you, O Prince of Peace. That is what I want to do. I give you praise, for you are my righteousness. I worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you. On bended knee I come, with a humble heart I come, bowing down before your holy throne, lifting holy hands to you, as I pledge my love anew. I worship you in spirit, I worship you in truth. Make my life a holy praise unto you. On bended knee I come, with a broken heart I come, bowing down before your holy throne. As I look upon your face, show your mercy and your grace. Change my life, O Holy Spirit. Make me fresh and never new. Make my life a holy sacrifice to you. Make my life a holy sacrifice to you. On bended knee I come, with a humble heart I come, bowing down before unto you.
In the view of many, Christianity is defined in terms of what you cannot do. And I know you've all experienced that, and perhaps have been raised in traditions where that was a big emphasis. Among those who seek to live holy lives, certain things have been identified that were considered worldly, like playing cards, going to movies, wearing makeup and jewelry, reading novels. You've never heard that one? I have. Listening to rock music. And you can add a bunch of other ones to that. And some folks have looked at others who did those things and thought, that's not a true Christian. I mean, obviously. I'm not making fun of these convictions. Although, when I was a student at what is now Heritage University, we used to jokingly say that the rule of thumb is, I don't drink, dance, or chew, and I don't go with girls who do. That defines a faithful Christian. Freedom in Christ does not mean that anything goes, that nothing is unlawful and unhealthy. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But there's a real danger in letting things like that define what it means to be a Christian, and defining what the church is. Brenda and I remember when we went to Alabama, we quickly learned, somebody kind of whispered to us, by the way, we don't use playing cards. Huh? You mean the kind of cards you used to play rummy? Yeah, you know, the ones with the kings and the queens and all that stuff. Why? Well, because they're associated with gambling. And the way they told us, they said, many of us do use those. But you just have to know that if you invite somebody over, you might not want to bring those cards out. They might be offended. They said, so what people do is they play Uno. Oh, Rook. It was Rook. And so we learned to play Rook at that time. Isn't that where we learned Uno as well? Oh, I guess we learned Uno from some pagans around here. I guess so. We also learned not that Christians don't engage in mixed bathing. And of course that was a shock at first, because we never thought that was okay anyways, until we learned that meant that a boy and a girl would go into the lake at the same time. That was mixed bathing. So, oh, okay. Anyways, there were a bunch of other things that kind of define, and I learned that it's different from culture to culture. That when we were in England 20 or 40 some years ago, they had communion juice that was real wine. You can imagine my shock when I tossed down that little container. Whoa! It had a hit to it. But they do things weird in England, right? They speak strange. They say that about us, but we know we're right and they're wrong. About 8 years ago, when Missy and her kids and husband moved to London for a year, we went over in the fall to visit them, and Missy had found this church that she really liked. It was not like us. It was a Hillsong church. But the core was just like us. I liked it. Brenda really didn't care for it. But I got to tell you, at the end of the service, the preacher, he said, oh, by the way, a bunch of us are going to meet at the pub this evening for a pint. You might want to join us. And I thought, say what? Can you imagine me doing that? We're going to meet at the pub for a pint. You want to join us? Different cultures, Now, were they Bible-believing? Oh, yeah, they were on fire for the Lord and reaching many, many, many people. Okay, different culture. And so the danger is when you define Christianity by those external things, you're probably getting something wrong and you're leaving somebody out. There's a bigger danger than that even, because it puts the emphasis on those things and not on Christ. That's exactly what Paul is addressing in this section of Colossians, because not all who look religious are spiritually minded, and that's what he's going for, is those who have the mind and heart of Christ. And so let's look at this from Colossians 2, starting with 16. I'm going to use the English Standard Version of this one because I like the phrasing in it, and it makes some things clear. It's actually more literal in its translation of this section. He says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism." Does anybody know what asceticism means? It's an approach to religion where you deprive yourself of things. And you'll see, we'll give some detail on that in a moment. "And worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God." He says, "If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch," referring to things that all perish as they are used, "according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh." So he talks about do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And that really sums up that asceticism approach to religion. It emphasizes the virtue of denying yourself things that are comfortable and pleasing. And so from that approach came this idea that anything that tastes good or is fun must be sinful. In fact, it went even further. In the early centuries, this idea that abstaining from marriage was a greater virtue than marrying and raising a family. That it would be better to not eat meat. It would be better to wear rough, uncomfortable clothing, so that every time it gets hot, you sweat and itch. It reminds you of the suffering that Christ went through. That taking a vow of poverty is the way Christians ought to live. That prosperity is not for the Christian. And part of the assumption behind that was that you can't be married to Christ and be married to a woman. You cannot enjoy normal life and be totally dedicated to serving Christ. I think we've seen that among one major religious denomination, that's stuck, isn't it? And to this day, it's believed, it's taught and enforced that priests are not allowed to marry. Now, did you know that the Russian Orthodox Church, which separated the Western and Eastern churches, split in, I don't know, what was it? It was after 600, I believe, that Eastern Orthodox, the priests marry. Or they can, at least. Not all of them, obviously. I think he identifies the same approach to religion from two different sources. The first was essentially Old Covenant holdovers. When he says, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink or regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Leviticus defines the meats that Jews are allowed to eat, and they are not allowed to eat lobster, shrimp, pork. They are considered unclean. We know now, down the road after the cross, we know that what was going on was God was teaching them a principle. There may have also been a health benefit in what he was doing. But the prime thing he was doing in the book of Hebrews, majors on explaining this, he says those food regulations were a shadow of what was to come. He was teaching to be separate from sin, the concept of separation. And he never meant for those food regulations to last forever. And so when Gentiles started becoming Christians, that was an issue. The Jewish Christians felt, well, the Gentiles also should keep away from pork and shellfish. But that was not God's will. The observation of holy days. Now, you know, the word holiday in current English comes from holy day. But I don't think you'd exactly consider the 4th of July a holy day, would you? But it's a national holiday. So we've kind of drifted a little bit from that original idea. But originally, this concept that there were holy days and certain festivals that were to be observed as part of the religious life of Israel. You know, Passover, which commemorated the escape from Egypt. The Day of Atonement, which was the time of penance and a special sacrifice that was offered on behalf of the people. The Feast of Booths, which would remind them of their wilderness wanderings and God's provision for them. Pentecost, which was like the Jewish Thanksgiving. All of these were important and they taught spiritual lessons. And to this day, Passover tells the story of the Exodus. Some Christian churches occasionally have a Seder meal, or Seder, I guess it's pronounced, which is the Passover meal. And in it, the instructions are given about what everything represents, because there's tremendous symbolism in it that points to Christ. And that's why Jesus chose that Passover meal to be that Last Supper where he set up what we do every week. But, as Paul says here, those things were a shadow of Jesus. Now the real thing, the substance has come. We don't observe the shadows anymore. We don't have to. And so don't let anybody bind that on you. And by the way, that meant both for someone who was from a Gentile background, who did not grow up observing those things. He's saying, if you're a Gentile, don't let anybody force you to observe the Sabbath. Don't let anybody make you observe the Day of Atonement or Passover. It will not get you closer to God. And he was also speaking to Jews. You have the option. If it's still in your conscience that you should observe those things, it's okay to do it. Just don't think that it's going to take the place of the atonement of Christ and gaining you closeness to God. If it maintains its place as a spiritual lesson that reminds you of spiritual principles, it's okay. But don't let anybody force it on you. In fact, Jesus encountered this a couple of years before the cross and made a really strong point. I want to show you something that he says in Mark chapter 7. In the background to this was that the religious people, the leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Sadducees, which are also a sect, a denomination of of Jews, they had applied the sanitary laws that were put in Leviticus and decided that there's a certain way you have to wash your eating utensils and your cooking utensils before you can use them. It wasn't necessarily based on an insight about germs, but it was a religious ritual. And also they had a regulation about how their hands were to be washed. Now, I know that Paul, as a healthcare professional, thinks that hand washing is a religious thing because they hammer that, don't they? Nancy does too. So here, these two people have the cleanest hands in this whole church. No, probably when you're off work, you never wash your hands. Just kidding. I advocate hand washing, by the way. Good way to stop the spread of bacteria and viruses, right? I just remembered there's a third person with clean hands. Pat, your hands are clean, aren't they? Yeah, I know they are. And there are other people who follow that as well. But it's not going to get you closer to God. It might help you prevent getting the flu and passing it to somebody else, but it doesn't impress God. He's not going to say, oh, there's a person I'm going to let in heaven because they wash their hands. The Jews of Jesus' day practically believed that you would be unclean ceremonially. In other words, in the eyes of God, you'd have to go like this to you if you didn't observe the careful ritual of hand washing with the proper amount of water and the proper procedures. And by the way, it's interesting how close it is to modern medical procedures, because they teach you when you wash your hands, rub them for like 15, 20 seconds, use a minimum amount of water, a certain amount of water on them, and don't turn the faucet off with your hand because that's probably soil. So, you might kind of do this, to turn the faucet off, or you dry your hand while the water's running and use the tissue. Well, that's practically what they said. You let the water run down your elbow and air dry when you wash your hands. But look at what Jesus said, because, he and his disciples were under a microscope all the time. And if they didn't do things exactly according to the Jewish traditions, suddenly they were irreligious. So here's what he says. Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him? Since it enters not his heart but his stomach and is expelled? You know what that means. Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. You get his point? They thought that washing their hands properly was going to make them holy. And he says, you're talking about external things that don't change a thing. What really counts is what's inside the spiritual heart, the mind. That's what counts. That's what changes you. David, I've reflected on Good Friday when we were down at Township Park. And David, our newest brother in Christ, was down there helping us and walking the 14 stations of the cross with us. And I noticed that Nick Irochi, our county prosecutor, was there. He's become a good friend. And at the end of it, I said, David, I want you to meet somebody. So I went over and I said, Nick, I want you to meet David. David, this is Nick. He said, are you Nick Irochi? But how I introduced David was, I said, Nick, I want you to meet David. He's given his life to Christ. And so you're probably never going to get to know him in a professional way. Now think about it. If we did our job as the church, whose mission is to make disciples of all nations, and to make disciples of all neighborhoods in our county, in our state, in our world, we could put the county prosecutor out of business. He'd have to retire. Wouldn't that be great? Because isn't that what it's about? When you're talking about what are the best law enforcement techniques, crime prevention, isn't the best crime prevention for every one of us having Christ in our hearts? Exactly. So, what I jokingly said when I introduced those guys, that's true for me. I can say to Nick, you're probably never going to get to know me in a professional way because I am seeking to follow Jesus. Does that mean that everyone who's seeking to follow Jesus makes no mistakes and never gets in trouble with the law? Of course not. But it changes the odds, doesn't it? There's a much better percentage we're going to avoid that stuff. And we're going to be able to help other folks. And it gives us a greater insight to those who've been on that path and wanting to help them to get on a better path and hope to have Christ in their hearts. Because of what Jesus said here. One more place I want to show you. It's 1 Timothy chapter 4, because Paul is dealing with this, apparently Timothy is dealing with this in Ephesus. And the same kind of false teaching is cropping up there. And so when he writes to his young mentee, the guy he's training in ministry, he says this. Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times, some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. I want you to notice the category he puts this in. This is no minor stuff. This is not just differences in religious opinion. He says these teachings come from the devil himself. They're demonic teachings. Through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word of God and prayer. By the way, you want to know why we ask God's blessing on the meal? There it is. It's not like, when someone says, would you bless the food? I don't even think of it that way, because it's like, suddenly it becomes holy. That's not what it's about. It is saying, God, thank you for feeding me. I am grateful to you. It's not a matter of, I deserve this. It's a matter of, I'm in awe of God because He allows me to eat every day. That's where our heart should be. And so, in Ephesus, this idea was creeping in that certain leaders could make rules about what you can eat and what you can't eat. By the way, what you can drink and what you cannot drink. That one is a little more popular to this day, isn't it? We're going to talk about that in a second. Let me wrap this by suggesting that sometimes abstaining is spiritually beneficial. Not asceticism, not a system of religion where you gain brownie points with God by depriving your body and suffering. But sometimes it's beneficial. First of all, when your own spiritual health is at stake. If you have suffered from gambling compulsion, you have no business buying lottery tickets or having dinner at a casino. If you have struggled with alcoholism, don't fool yourself and And then thinking I can have a beer every now and then, and it's never going to get a hold of me again. Because it probably will. There is no kind of deception worse than self-deception. So does that mean that applies to everybody? No. No. Likewise, if you have been addicted to opioids and your doctor prescribes Vicodin or oxycodone to you, challenge him and say, can't take that stuff. Don't say, well, you know, if I just use it in moderation, oh no. You're going to be in trouble again real fast. Keep away from it. Run from it. Be terrified of it. Have an irrational fear of it. Even as in the letters, Paul says, flee fornication. He's saying, don't dabble. Don't stick your toe in the water. Don't take a chance. Now, does that mean that there is no valid, legitimate use of oxycodone or Vicodin? No, there is. Carefully prescribed, carefully monitored, only for people who have never had and don't have an addiction to it. A lot of folks are choosing, you know what, I'm not going to even take a chance. I found myself, when I had the surgery, gave me a prescription for 7 days. Now, it used to be they'd give you 30 days of oxy. Gave me a prescription of 7 days, 5 milligram tablets that could be used as much as 3 times a day. It was like that little bottle was like, and then when I was, I gotta have something. Okay, I'll take one. And I used half of it. And just the other day, I went up to the police department. Did you know that if you go in the back door where the dispatch area is, they'll buzz you in, they got a camera, and you have to buzz in, and they'll let you in. They've got a bin where you can put prescriptions. You tear the label off or mark it out so they don't see your name, and you just drop it in there and they'll dispose of it. I don't want that around my house. If you have a history of heart problems or diabetes or acid reflux, you know that there are certain foods that you should avoid for your own good. That does not mean that you should make the rule for everyone. That doesn't mean that your mission in life is to run around telling people, don't eat spicy foods, don't eat spicy foods. Or necessarily, and I admit this is a change from what I would have said 40 years ago, 30 years ago even. Don't drink a beer, don't have any wine. Drinking or not drinking does not make you more holy. Drunkenness? Oh, there's no question about that. Now, how much do you have to consume before you're drunk? Before it affects you? I suggest it's well below the legal limit. If you have a buzz, then you've stepped over the biblical line. So that should control us. And as far as foods, if somebody chooses to abstain from meat, Mike and I were riding our bikes yesterday. Went down past Brakel. Of course, for him, that's torturing him now. He's become a vegetarian. He used to be the world's biggest carnivore. But he's chosen, and he's doing great. He's healthy as all. Not a horse. He doesn't eat horses anymore. But he's fit, and he's good, and that could be part of it. Also the fact that he rides his bike 5,000 miles a year, that helps. And Anyways, we're coming back toward Break Wall, and my pedal falls off. And we don't have a tool to put it on, so I stop and I'm talking to Mike Morgan. Well, Mike races home to my house and brings my Allen wrenches back, and we put the pedal back on. And so Mike is fixing some food on the smoker, and he gives us some, oh my goodness, he was smoking potatoes, roast potatoes. Oh, he said, here, let me give you each one. So he gave us each a sample. He said, you want to try some meat? And Micah said, I don't eat meat anymore, but I really regret that right now. But you know what? Thankfully, he doesn't run around telling everybody they should be vegetarian. If he did, I'd hammer him. And so, there is freedom. What he is saying here is Christ has freed us from the burden of the law. Don't let anybody put you under a yoke of slavery again. Because when you submit to human control, you're probably not following the control of Jesus. So if there's some issues in your life, you wrestle with God about those. Seek counsel from fellow Christians. Yeah. But you make a decision with God. And so if you come to a conscious decision that alcohol will never touch my lips, you make that with God, you stick with it. If you come to a conclusion that meat will never go past my teeth, I honor that. In fact, when I have you for dinner, when we go to a restaurant, I'm going to make sure that they have some delicious vegetarian options. I was just thinking, this Tuesday is the Chamber of Commerce Business Expo. And for some reason, I volunteered for the kitchen years ago, and now I'm stuck there. So I'm doling out hot dogs. And it's kind of fun because I have contact with all the people that come in. But I was thinking, they use the best Smith's hot dogs. Smith's hot dogs are not all beef. They have pork in them. And I thought, what if we have some Jewish or Muslim people there, or vegetarians? I decided I'm going to buy some all-beef hot dogs and some vegetarian hot dogs and bring them and have them available. And so if somebody asks, do you have any vegetarian ones? I'll say, give us 3 minutes and we'll roast one of these for you. Why? Why should I care about that? Because I care about their conscience. Because, by the way, one more thing. Everything, Paul says, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. Not everything builds you up. Not everything makes you stronger. Isn't that a beautiful definition of freedom and its limits? I remember in government, in high school, the teacher said, everybody stand up, put your arms out. That's the limits of your freedom. When you hit your neighbor in the head with your hand, that's where your freedom ends. Oh, that makes sense to me. I have a lot of freedom, but not to hurt my neighbor. I have the freedom to respect my neighbor. You have freedom, but not everything will help you become more like Christ. And so choose those things. But be careful, because what tends to happen is the person with the strongest personality in the group tends to define what those limits are for everybody else. Don't let that happen. We need to respect each other, and respect each other's consciences, and respect each other's freedom. Because the second reason that can be beneficial to abstain is when someone else is going to stumble because of our behavior. I just mentioned the hot dog issue. I don't want someone to stumble. And this came to my mind because several years ago, somebody came up. I was working the counter with somebody else, and they said, "Are these all beef?" And they said, "Yes." And so they took the hot dogs and walked off with them before I had a chance to say anything, because I noticed that the lady had her head covered, the scarf, and you know what that meant? She was Muslim. She ate a pork hot dog. Now, there's no way that it harmed her conscience because she didn't know, but she was given the wrong information. Why should I care about a Muslim? Because I'm supposed to love my neighbor, right? For early church ran into this often. Some people are so accustomed, Paul writes, to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We're no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. It was widely known in the first century world that the pagan temples, they would have a sacrifice, offer the meat to an idol. They would sell half the meat in the market. It was high quality meat. So when you went to the grocery store to get hamburger, you never knew what its source was. It could have come from a pagan temple. And Paul is saying, we know that an idol is nothing. It's a fake. And so meat offered to an idol is no different from any other meat. But a person who comes from a pagan background and at one time thought that idol was something, it could bother their conscience. And so what happened in the first century in the church, former pagans very often chose to be vegetarians, just so they would not take the chance. And so you've got in the congregation, maybe half the congregation is vegetarians out of conscience, and the other half knows that, that idol is nothing, and so I can freely eat the meat, even if it comes right from a pagan temple, and it's not going to defile me. How do you manage that? How do you deal with that? Do you make a rule that at our potlucks we're having no meat? Do you let the non-meat eaters rule and say, we don't even want to be in the same room with it? Or do you let the meat eaters rule in saying, they can fend for themselves, we're going to have meat? And if there's nothing without meat in it, too bad. Now, what you do is you say, find a way to love each other. Maybe the way is, like we ran into with the Hindus in Tanzania. This Rotary Club had Christian and Hindu and Buddhist members. And Muslim members. So they would put the vegetarian dishes out first. And the vegetarians would go first and get their meat, get their food. Then they would put the meat dishes out. And the rest would go through and get their food. And Brenda always chose the vegetarian dishes. Because we learned a long time ago, you never know what the meat is anyways. And where it came from. So it suited her just fine. Me? Anything goes. Maybe I'm eating giraffe. Maybe I'm eating rat. So what? If they'll eat it, I'll eat it. But you find a way to respect each other and love each other without making a rule that excludes one. But this principle applies to practical situations today. I'm not going to offer a glass of wine to a person if there's a chance that it's going to cause them to fall back into addiction. I'm not going to trick a vegetarian into eating meat, just so I can say, see, it didn't hurt you. if it would violate their conscience. If we love people, we're going to be sensitive to their needs. We will try to see things from their point of view, even if we disagree with them on where they fall out on these matters. And so if I encounter someone who comes from a tradition that using playing cards is sinful, questionable, they will never see them. We're going to bring out the Uno cards, the one cards, and just avoid the conscience issue. Well, here's the third reason for abstaining, and that is when voluntary sacrifice of your rights will help you reach someone for Christ. We live in such a self-centered world. It has been called the me generation. But people who live for themselves are shallow and without an important purpose in life. You know that. If you've been through a phase of that in your life, you realize you weren't happy that way. But when you see that you're a benefit to somebody else, that you've got some people in your life who depend upon you, that need you, and you have that interdependence, life is much more rewarding. When you make a positive impact on somebody else's life, you start realizing, this is why God put me here. And so, Jesus set that example, didn't he? Didn't he say, I came not to be served, but to serve. And to give my life as a ransom for many. That was his whole reason for being. And so, the Son of God, the royal deity, comes to earth not as a king who drives a Maserati, but as a servant who rides a donkey. He's not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but with a piece of straw in his mouth. And he said, I came to serve. Washes the disciples' feet, you know the whole thing. And so Paul says, here's my approach. He says, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Paul defined himself as the Jew of Jews, tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day, of the sect of Pharisees, trained by the greatest Jewish teacher of all time, and yet made to be the apostle of the Gentiles. And so Paul says, when I'm hanging around Gentiles, I eat pig. And when I am in an audience of Jews, I abstain from pork. What? Paul the chameleon? Oh no. Paul the man who says, my preferences mean nothing. Because my goal is to win others. Whoa. And so, our goal should be to generously and joyfully be willing to lay aside our rights in order to win somebody else to Christ. So maybe you hate fishing, but you learn to fish because you're trying to reach a guy who's a fisherman. Maybe you care nothing for golf. There's There's this guy that you know, you get a captive audience if you learn to play golf and spend a day on the links with him. Paul observed the Sabbath when it helped him reach a Jew. And he lived like a Gentile when it helped him reach Gentiles. You see, in this age of racial and ethnic identity, Paul gave up that identity in order to win others for Christ. He said, I'm a servant of Christ, and I'm your servant. Well, you could just start imagining what that means in your own life and how you approach things. It's not a matter of compromising, but it's a matter of saying, how can I be the least offensive to somebody in order to open their heart up to get the gospel into it? Let me wrap by just emphasizing again. You have been freed from sin's penalty and from its slavery. Don't let any human make you a slave again. Not even preachers, especially not preachers. You're free to enjoy life. You're free. And you're also free to give up your privileges for a higher cause. But it has to be your choice. And when you do it, it has to be because that's where your heart is, and that's what you want to do to serve God. You have the freedom to love graciously and generously and in a way that will make people see Christ in their daily life. What a privilege. Let's
I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. The world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The eagles bury me on heaven's open door, and I can't be left alone in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't be my God.